Big Dirty Unclean Boy, Episode 3. Sort of. It's going to be a weird little video this week because A, I'm doing it alone, Guy's busy repainting one of his most popular models for a painting competition, and B, this is just a test. A test of my ability to make textures and sculpt details for the skin and guts of our collaborative giant Great Unclean One, the biggest Warhammer Nurgle demon ever made! I've sculpted stuff before, but not on this scale. I've made lots of little animations in the past and had to make all my own characters, sculpting over armatures, but those models were pretty cute and weren't covered in boils and pustules. I've also sculpted a quote-unquote skin for the Unclean Oogie Boogie, but that was mostly just pressing Hessian into Milliput. This is going to take a lot more work. My name's Hatty, you're watching Midwinter Minis, and let's just crack on, shall we? Now, to make these test pieces, I'm going to use a couple of those offcuts of expanding filler foam that we cut off from the giant Great Unclean One when we were sculpting his body. I've stuck them down to a bit of card and I'm going to make one that's painted as guts and one as a test for the skin with loads of textures sculpted into it. To make those textures, I realised I was going to have to make my own sculpting tools. I was inspired by this video from Fiveheader, who made tools out of green stuff stuck to the other end of old paintbrushes, so I'm going to do exactly that for mine. But first, I headed down to the local craft shop and bought this cute little selection of beads to make some interesting knobbly textures, as well as these sticky pearl things and some pins to use as sculpting tools by themselves. To start making the tools, I gathered these rubbish brushes Guy bought from Temu, sorry Guy, and I'm going to mix up a bunch of green stuff and stick it to the ends of them. Because I want a few different textures for the skin, I'm going to be adding different things to each of these tools. Like these tiny beads all over one of them, one big bead at the end of this one, which flopped when I left it to dry overnight. That's interesting looking. And then I want to make some lumps on the skin, so I'm going to poke holes into this one and see how well that works. Now all my tools are finished and have been left to cure overnight, let's test them out. We wanted to figure out the best material to sculpt with. Oven-baked stuff is obviously out of the question because this thing is way too big for an oven already, and it has foam inside which would melt. So we need air drying stuff. As much as we'd like to cover this whole thing in Milliput, we don't want to have to take out a huge bank loan to buy enough to cover it. So let's see how much detail we can put into regular air drying DAS clay. I'm going to start squishing the tools into the surface and see what kind of textures we can get. Now, a quick trypophobia warning here. This thing is going to be covered in holes, so if you don't want to see any of that, you might want to skip this video. I'll catch you next time. Anyway, I've covered my piece of foam in DAS clay and I'm going to start squashing these tools into the surface and see what kind of textures we can get. Ooh, this is fun. Some of them work better than others. The one I poked holes into that makes lumps on the skin looks great, in fact. We also have some other tools to work with, like this pointy thing and this tiny rake that I've used here to make some wrinkles, following this incredibly realistic sculpting guide I found on YouTube. And then Guy suggested I try rolling a ball of foil over the piece in spaces that weren't textured, and that worked surprisingly well. Then I stuck in a few of those little pearls, and I think that's all the tools used. I'm going to leave it out to dry overnight, and in the meantime I'm going to start testing some paints on the oozy, spilly guts. I've already coated my second piece of foam offcut here in gesso, so it's at the same point of readiness as the big boy himself. And now I'm going to prime it in grey primer before choosing a paint scheme. I'm going to try these various pinks and reds for my main colours, with a deep purple shadow to make them look more sore and yucky. Starting with a generic pink base coat, I then washed it down with a pinkish red wash and added some of that lovely purple wash in the deeper parts of the guts and bits that needed to look more bruisey. Once that was dry, I dry brushed over the surface texture with this mix of pink and yellow to give it a bit of dimension. Then I played around with adding a bit of thinned red contrast paint on some areas and adding a brighter highlight with a lighter pink and yellow mix. And then to finish it off and make it look all bloody, I mixed blood for the blood god with some gloss varnish and coated it in a thin layer all over. Perhaps a lighter coat of this, or some in just the recesses, would work better for the final piece, because I feel like this knocked back all those previous layers a bit too much. But this is why we do test pieces. Let me know what you think about it in the comments. For one final addition, I'm going to put on some Nurgle's Rot, which is this gross, glossy, snot-coloured paint to make the guts look more oozy and give that red some contrast. Yeah, I think that looks great. Right, now that's drying, I'll go back to the skin test piece. To start out, again I primed it in grey and then I picked out my paints. I think this selection of muted warm greens could work nicely. After a base coat of Death Guard green, I washed the whole thing in a warm green wash to match, before adding some blobs of that same purple wash from before, and a flesh coloured wash to add more of a fleshy tone to the skin. Then, to bring out all those lovely textures, I dry brushed over with this lighter yellow-green, and then again with a peachy skin tone mixed in to bring a gross rotting skin look. Then I tested some highlight colours for a lighter dry brush and painted some of the pustules in this yellowy fleshy mix. After a final dry brush on just the highest parts of the textures and focal points using pure ice yellow, I noticed that it was looking quite flat and that all those different coloured washes had disappeared, so I added in those colours again over the top. Then Guy suggested as a final tip to mix some ice yellow with gloss varnish to make some realistic looking pus to add an extra gross vibe. And yeah, that is absolutely disgusting. Now to paint both of the rims of the pieces black, and I'd call them finished. Now, as I mentioned before, these are just test pieces for the actual Giant Great Unclean One, so the paint recipes aren't set in stone. If you have any better ideas for how we could paint the skin and the guts, please let us know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye! Is that two jazz hands?
That's great.